Podcasting from a little cabin on a hill. This is the Stacy Westfall Podcast. Stacy's goal is simple: to teach you to understand why horses do what they do, as well as the action steps for creating clear, confident communication with your horses.
I'm Stacy Westfall, and I teach people how to understand, enjoy, and successfully train their own horses. In this first season of the podcast, I'm going to be discussing issues that frequently affect the rider's thinking. In today's podcast, I'm going to focus on discussing the idea of responsibility, but I'm going to make this into a two-part series. And in this first part, I want to talk about the stages that I actually see riders go through when they are learning with horses. And again, we're just going to stay in the rider's mind. And the first stage that I tend to see riders jump into is the dreaming stage. And in the dreaming stage, this is where, as riders, whether we picture ourselves at any age, there's this very, I call it, when I refer to it myself, I call it my Disney moments. And so there is this very Disney type feeling to some of my thoughts around this dreaming stage. And this is a stage that most people enter horses through. And that could be cowboy movies and you were dreaming about being a cowboy, or that could be watching Spirit too many times on a loop and wanting to jump into that. Or for me, it was the Black Stallion books. But either way, there's this dreaming stage. And then at some point, people often transition into the learning stage. Unfortunately, a lot of times people transition from dreaming to learning after some kind of a setback. And either which way, however they end up there, this learning phase generally kicks off a lot of thoughts about how this functions. So I call it the nuts and bolts of the relationship stuff. And so it's the nuts and bolts of move the hip here, and this causes this to happen. And if we want to get a lead change, then the shoulder goes over here. It doesn't sound anything like a Disney movie. And the third and final stage that I see is this kind of balanced stage. So we've got dreaming, learning, and then balancing. And in this balancing stage, what I see is someone who is daring to believe in both of the stages. You'll notice that when I was talking about the dreaming stage, I said I picture myself and call it the Disney stage, because I still want to live with one foot in that magical world, because that's what I enjoy. And I definitely want another piece of me to be in that nuts and bolts. How do things work? And these are mental constructs that I'm giving you here. And I think that if you can get to this third stage where you can say, learning more doesn't mean I have to give up dreaming. And dreaming is not less than learning. When you can get to this point where this balancing thing happens, it's a beautiful place, because it's going to affect the responsibility that everybody has. So typically, when you're in the dreaming stage, if I rewind to myself as a kid, I thought it just happened. I thought it just worked, because I was actually, without the words, giving all the responsibility to the horse. And what happens a lot of times with that is that people get this stuck feeling because they keep giving the horse all of the responsibility, and then they wonder why the horse makes choices that are unsafe or undesirable over and over again. And that's a lot of times because we're just hoping that the horse will come up with this idea that we want, and they just don't think quite like Spirit did or the Black Stallion. And so in that dreaming stage, you can kind of get that little bit of a stuck feeling there. Now, in the learning stage, there can actually get to the point where there's too much of the nuts and bolts. And this is where I think a lot of times when people leave the horse industry, either they leave because they were in the dreaming stage and then they got hurt and that ended the dream and they didn't move to learning. Or you get people that are in the learning stage. And I know I personally went through in the middle of this learning stage where, and that's why I say nuts and bolts now, it got so nuts and bolts specific that I didn't believe there was any magic left anymore. This little teeny tiny itty bitty corner of me did believe that there was still that magic, to the point where I was ready to like quit becoming a professional horse trainer and try to figure out how I could get back to that magic I was feeling. But long story short, it was this nuts and bolts of the learning phase that was kind of getting me down, because it was so structured more like machinery, which is also why sometimes I'll say that trainers will make horses be robotic, because that was my view of how this nuts and bolts and robotic system was working. And thankfully, I found my way through a whole series of events to discovering this more balanced phase, which is where someone can actually believe in both dreaming and in learning. And the beauty of that is that if you're doing both, it's really difficult for you to criticize somebody who's in either one of the stages. So I do not criticize people who are dreaming, and I do not criticize people who are learning. And I would love if they could join me and be doing both, because it's such a beautiful thing. And when I think about how this affects people when they're with their horses, in that very early stage when I was in the dreaming stage predominantly, my mom was trying to teach me some stuff, so I was still a learner, but I was really dreaming. There were a lot of mistakes that I made because I just figured, guessed, assumed that the horse would just magically fill in that blank. So looking back, my recommendation is if you find yourself just hoping that things would get better, that's a sign that you might be spending a little bit too much time in the dreaming phase. And if, when I move to that next phase, to the learning phase, if you find yourself getting a little bit bogged down and wondering if there is really this magic that you thought you had experienced at one point, you did. I will tell you, you did. And you can experience that magic when you're around the horses, sitting in a movie theater, reading a book like the Black Stallion, and then you can experience it when you go and you be around them, but you also will end up experiencing the fact that there is stuff you need to learn about how their herd dynamics work and what they look at as responsibility or what they look at as leadership. And so when you jump into that, don't get so lost in the weeds that you forget that you are still on the path of the dreamer also. And then this is kind of an interesting thing, because a lot of times the people who become horse trainers are very often in that learner phase, and probably learner only phase a lot of times. And that can become a bit of a frustrating stage. That's what I experienced, was that as a trainer who was trying to accomplish these goals for the owners, what happened was I ended up feeling more like I just had to be able to, I had to cut out all the dreaming phase of it, and I just had to make it very structured, and it lost some of that dreaming stuff. And I remember a long, long time ago when I was in college and I was dating my husband, Jesse, and I said to him, why would somebody start training horses if they don't even like them? Because coming from Maine and not having seen the industry, it was kind of like I jumped straight in, and I was like, there appear to be a lot of professional horse trainers that don't like horses. And he said, well, they didn't start like that. And I think it's a brilliant observation, because it's true. I'm sure at some point they started in some kind of the dreaming phase, and then they moved into this phase that I'm calling the learner phase, but they actually moved more and more and more towards just this robotic type of a training. And so there was a real pressure there as a professional trainer to move towards this, this is just like it's an assembly line. It's a mechanical type of a thing. And so if you're a professional with horses and you're experiencing any of that, know that what you're experiencing is something that other people experience, but you don't have to accept it. You can actually write your own rules. So what I'd like you to do as an activity at the end of this podcast is just take a minute and reflect on the stages and see, are you in predominantly one stage or the other? Are you spending more time in one of those or the other? If you're doing both, if you're in that balancing stage, are you switching back and forth fairly frequently? Or is there an area where you're stuck? Because I also see that you can get stuck in certain areas where you're not moving forward because maybe you're spending a little bit too much time. Maybe you're really good with one thing with the horse, but not so good with the other because you're getting stuck in that dreamer mode. Or maybe you're getting disheartened because you're stuck in that learning nuts and bolts phase and you're getting a little bit burned out on that. So stop and reflect. And if you want to share or read what other people are experiencing, jump over to stacywestfall.com and you will find the podcast show notes for this episode. Thank you.
If you enjoy listening to Stacy's podcast, please visit stacywestfall.com for articles, videos, and tips to help you and your horse succeed.